Welcome to this session on social and emotional learning as a lever for equity and social justice. My name is Amy McConnell Franklin. We are making this recording from northern New Mexico in the high mountains, and we are in the southwestern United States. We are at our family home and unexpectedly here because of COVID. I and my husband Bob left Chiang, Thailand, where we've been living most of the last 4 years. Coming here in March, we thought for 3 weeks, but being able to stay largely because of the pandemic and not being able to return safely to Thailand. I've been able to jump back into my work in social and emotional learning and emotional intelligence, working with teachers, social service agencies, and mental health providers, helping children bridge the challenging situations and continue to learn. In Thailand, I left collaborations with the local university as well as with schools working with refugees, primarily ethnic minority children and youth from Myanmar, many of whom had been born in Thailand in refugee camps in some of the most protracted refugee situations in the world. I'm grateful for Zoom and the internet to be able to continue the collaborations. We are particularly interested in researching resiliency in refugees and existing skills that lead to resiliency and mapping those onto models of social and emotional learning. Today we will be covering in this session some definitions of social and emotional learning and some models that are common here in the United States and are used worldwide. We will then also have a case study showing how a student exchange program was able to, through the integration of social and emotional learning, develop a transformative educational opportunity based in social justice. So social and emotional learning, SEL, has become a very popular concept these days in education. It basically refers to the processes through which adults and children in school learn self-awareness, self-regulation, social awareness, responsible decision-making, and relationship skills. It's a big umbrella. It includes topics such as character education, emotional intelligence, responsible decision-making. You might think of them as horses of the same herd. They're all the capacities to shed an inner light on yourself and better understand the inner landscape of yourself and others, and responsibly recognize and utilize emotions in self and others in order to accomplish positive outcomes, pro-social outcomes. We've been grateful to be in the field of emotional intelligence and social and emotional learning in education for about the past 20 years. And I'm particularly grateful for the articulation of the social and emotional learning as a foundation for social justice and equity in its capacity to help youth and adults develop a sense of identity, agency, and belonging. These are lifelong tasks. I'm grateful to be involved in work that can help young people have conversations and engage in exercises and practices that help them develop those skills. So the models that we will be looking at briefly are the CASTLE model. CASTLE is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning at the University of Illinois, Chicago. It's a 25-year-old research organization that is probably the central warehouse for research and best practices in social emotional learning. It includes 5 components. Again, self-awareness, self-regulation, social awareness, responsible decision-making, and relationship skills. There is also a model by 6 Seconds, which is an international network of trainers and researchers in the area of emotional intelligence. It comprises 3 domains: know yourself, choose yourself, and give yourself. And within those 3 domains, there are 8 competencies: emotional literacy, recognizing patterns, consequential thinking, navigating emotions, engaging intrinsic motivation and choosing optimism, and finally, empathy and committing to a noble goal. The 3rd model we'll look at is the model of emotional intelligence from the Yale University Center for Emotional Intelligence. You'll see very similar outcomes of self-awareness and self-regulation, emotional expression, understanding and labeling emotions, and regulating emotions. And finally, we're looking at a model that I developed as a way of capturing the similarities between different models of emotional intelligence and social and emotional learning. It has 3 domains. They are awareness, intentionality, and a sense of choice or agency. So again, having awareness of self and others, context, histories, feelings, thoughts, actions, being intentional, aligning one's actions with one's values and priorities and intentions, and a sense of agency, being able to choose how you go through the world, what feelings you have, what thoughts you have, and how you express yourself. Now we are going to turn to my daughter, Key Franklin, who will share a case study of an experiment she facilitated with students from Singapore, working together and alongside students from Chiang.
Hello, my name is Key Franklin. I'm a facilitator, trainer, and coach. I've been based in Singapore for the last 7 years and just moved back to the US to join my family in New Mexico about 2 months ago. So I'm going to be telling you a little story about a experiential learning journey that I facilitated and designed in 2019, last year. So the context, I was working with a prestigious junior college in Singapore. There were about 20 ethnically Chinese students at that junior college, and they had a service learning component as part of their course. And so they had a requirement to do a service learning trip. And I was working for a small social enterprise that facilitated these service learning trips to different parts of Southeast Asia. So this particular service learning journey was designed and facilitated by myself and a co-lead. And this co-lead and I had a very clear intention, which was to essentially use the experiential learning journey to sort of subvert the common power dynamics that are present in service work or volunteerism. Oftentimes, there's a little bit of a savior complex or a sense of more resourced individuals going better the lives of less resourced individuals. So we decided that our intention was really to subvert that power dynamic. So what we did is we basically designed a 6-day experiential learning journey in Chiang for these students. And they were going to interact in a skills exchange program with 20 Burmese refugee students who were studying for their GED, which is the equivalent of an American high school degree, in Chiang Mai, Thailand. These refugee students would have grown up in refugee camps along the Thai-Myanmar border and would have fled Myanmar within the last few decades because of the immense political violence and ethnic discrimination that they would have faced in Myanmar. So the official reason that we were going to Thailand was, again, this service learning project. And so the way we kind of framed this was that the Singaporean students were going to impart college readiness skills to the Burmese students, because one thing that Singaporean students have a lot of is very incredible educational resources. So we decided to play upon that strength that they had, rather than having them do something perhaps more random but more common, like, for example, go and build a toilet or help to build a school, when most Singaporean students have never built a toilet nor a school, nor have any particular strength in construction. So what we did as part of this course is first to create and facilitate several preparatory courses for the students. So we basically wanted to equip them with both conceptual and experiential understanding of several things. So those things were threefold. Number one, we wanted to give them a exposure and experience with an asset-based or strengths-based lens. So we taught them a methodology called asset-based community development, and they practiced asset mapping. So basically what that involved is we described to them different forms of capital. For example, cultural capital, natural capital, social capital, intellectual capital. And then we had them go around their own school in Singapore before we left and map out the different forms of capital that existed. So that exercise was intended to give them an asset-based lens, such that when they went into a new context in Chiang Mai, they would be looking for the strengths and the forms of capital that exist, rather than lack and need. The second lens that we equipped them with was a lens about identity and power. So we asked the students to map out their personal identities, how they would define themselves, and their social identities, how others would define them. We spoke about, for example, the fact that all of them are ethnically Chinese, and many of them are Christian, and all of them are cisgender. We talked about what identities were not in the room and why those identities might not have been in the room. And so this got them to start thinking a little bit about the identities that they hold and the power and privilege associated with those identities. In addition to the lens of identity and power and the asset-based lens, we also equip the students with basic contextual information through a series of participatory mini lectures. So we basically explained to them the Thai-Myanmar refugee situation and some of the historical and political factors that had led to that situation. We also explained to them basic things like what is the difference between an internally displaced person, a refugee, and a migrant. Because coming from Singapore, where the refugee policy is quite clear-cut, many of them would not really have had much exposure to refugees in the way that they were about to. So we were working with an educational foundation in Chiang Mai that provides the opportunity for Burmese students to get a GED, which is the American high school degree equivalent. When we were in Chiang Mai, the trip comprised several components. The first was the promised college preparedness skills being imparted by the Singaporean students to the Burmese students. And the Singaporean students prepared a lot for this. They thought about how best to teach the skills that they had learned just months before from people at their school about, for example, how best to prepare for an interview, how to prepare a compelling personal statement, etc. We did, however, want there to really be a skills exchange so that it wasn't sort of a unidirectional giving and taking. So we asked that the Burmese students teach the Singaporean students some life skills that they had developed that the Singaporean students were less familiar with. Many of the Singaporean students, for example, would have had domestic helpers who lived with them and their families in Singapore, and therefore would have never had the chance to do much social reproductive labor. So in Chiang Mai, we had the Burmese students lead a cooking workshop and teach the Singaporean students all about cooking. And then that ended in a really grand feast that sort of marked the end of our trip. Additionally, we also brought in some of the lenses that we had prepared the students with beforehand. For example, the asset-based lens. So we had the Burmese students and the Singaporean students go around and map all of the assets in the area. Again, inviting both of them to step into an asset-based type of interaction. We also introduced concepts of power and identity with both groups in the same room. One exercise we did, for example, was to ask the Burmese students to map out their social identities and the Singaporean students to again map out their social identities, and then for them to place the social identities of themselves and all others who exist within their home communities on a piece of paper. And in the center of the paper would represent having more power, and on the periphery of the paper would represent having less power. And so we asked the students, how much power does your social identity have in your home community? For example, if I am a Karen female Buddhist youth, how much power do I have compared to a ethnic majority Burma male adult who's Christian in Myanmar? So we asked the students to kind of reflect on that. And then we asked them to reflect on how much power their social identity had in Chiang Mai, in the place that we both were at that time. And that led to some very, very fruitful conversations between the students, and it became uncomfortable in a very productive way that was able to be unpacked later on. Lastly, one thing that really tied together our entire trip was nightly reflections, where we really asked the students to reflect on what they had learned and how that perspective was changing over the course of the trip. We'd love to speak more about this case study, as well as the myriad ways that social-emotional learning and emotional intelligence can be a lever for social justice and equity during the Q&A. But just to share a few key insights that emerged for us from the case study. The first is, to put it bluntly, you can't teach what you don't know. My course co-lead and I were very fortunate to have had educational experiences that exposed us to things like power, identity, decoloniality, asset-based community development before leading the course. And we really do believe, upon reflection, that that was crucial to the course's success, because it turns out that the students, as much as listening to what we were saying, were primarily watching the way that we acted and the way that we were. The second key insight is the importance of developmentally appropriate content and pedagogy. One of the things that my course co-lead and I thought about and discussed at length before our course was how many of these students were about to graduate from junior college and go on to university, where they would hopefully undergo multiple processes of conscientization, be they political, social, or otherwise. And in that process, they would surely be encountering many of these same concepts, and we hope that this course could prepare them to be as open to that learning as possible. The third key insight is how crucial a strength-based approach is to success. By leveraging the existing strengths of both the Singaporean and the Burmese student, we were able to create interactions that honored and dignified both parties and really subverted the notion of savior and saved or resourced and under-resourced. And we feel that this is very important not only to successful and dignified service learning, but to any emotionally intelligent relationship. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you'll join us for the Q&A to discuss more about experiential learning, transformative education, and social emotional learning as a lever for social justice and equity. Thank you.
Thank you.